I'm going to introduce my first speaker, who is Dr. Chidi Oguamanam. He will be talking about biodiversity and ICH, use of Indigenous Local Knowledge. Dr. Oguamanam is currently working as a professor of law at the University of Ottawa. He's also the director of ABC Canada for sustainability and also health policies and ethics centers. So Dr. Oguamanam is given 15 minutes for the presentation. Let's welcome Dr. Oguamanam.
Thank you very much. It is a great pleasure to be invited to speak at this very important forum, and I'm so grateful to be invited. I thank the keynote speaker for that provocative intervention. And I want to frame my talk around stories and oral tradition in indigenous languages. And the theme of this year's ICH Forum spotlights how ICH is implicated in the context of the current global ecological crisis. I use the word implicated advisedly because it helps me to underscore that while ICH is endangered in the current global environmental crisis, it also holds a lot of prospects to mediate what I call our nature deficit. Now, I prefer a positive and provocative approach by focusing on indigenous linguistic diversity with special interest in stories and oral traditions as ICH of interest. I want to frame ICH and nature interface in deliberate metaphorical terms to enable me accomplish an objective. And that will be my third objective, to open up space for inviting more disciplines or disciplinary interests to participate in the discourse of ICH and nature. And to conclude, I want to suggest that in addition to safeguarding, we need to think about how to valorize and scale insights from indigenous stories as important epistemic tools to assist us with mitigating this great existential crisis of our time. And let's go to the backdrop of where the rain started beating us. It is this idea of Homo sapiens, the arrogance of the human nature that believes that the best environmental strategy is to subdue and to conquer. That approach has driven all of us into the ditch, into the greatest existential crisis of our time. We're talking about climate change and biodiversity crisis. We're talking about unprecedented species extinctions. And of course, as already highlighted in the keynote speech, the current pandemic we have and many more that are predicted to come as a result of the abuse of humans' relationship with other life forces, especially animals. And so what has languages, oral traditions, and expressions got to do with this? These are very unexplored tools for understanding and managing and safeguarding our diversities in species, in biology, and in ecology. And this is very important because every tool must be mobilized because there is a significant crisis that we have never seen in human history that is upon us right now. And when we talk about language, that's why I said I want to be very metaphorical and provocative. Language is always a synonym of the mouth and the tongue, and it is the gateway to the heart and the mind. And so my friends in medicine, in psychology, in religion and philosophy, and so many other disciplines that tend to be absent when we talk about ICH, I seek this platform to invite them. We know that oral health is linked to the heart health or to cardiovascular health. In psychology, we know this is very important. The connection between the mouth, the tongue, and the heart and the mind is so powerful. And the scriptures tell us that out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaketh. And wise philosophers tell us that a person's tongue can give you the taste of their heart. And this is metaphor as it sounds, but beyond these metaphors, the language, the tongue, and our linguistic perspective is the window and the gateway, the flashlight that opens our heart, our mind, our soul, our inner being, our inner essence. And when you put all of this together for a people that speak a language, you have a sense of their worldview. And so, how does this relate to indigenous peoples? I want to suggest, from all that we have known, that stories are at the heart of indigenous linguistic orientation. So indigenous peoples constitute perhaps the greatest human demographic showcase of the world's cultural and linguistic diversity, unlike any other civilization. And stories are at the heart of this linguistic diversity. And let me give you a sample. This is not global. This is just North America with emphasis on Canada. There are 600 indigenous peoples in North America speaking 60 languages. Think about the colonial binaries of English, French, sometimes Spanish. Very few languages, but there are 600 languages, 600 indigenous peoples. In Canada alone, we have 634 First Nation communities, and they constitute 5% of Canadian population. That is an incredible diversity. And because I said that stories are the heart of indigenous linguistic diversity, and these stories are beyond fiction and entertainment. Of course, there are fictionary aspects and entertainment components, but they are the canvas through which we see the mass of relationship, the network of relationships in the worldviews of indigenous peoples. Those stories tell us about weather, about seasons, about snow, about winter, about summer. They tell us about the creation, about the Mother Earth, about lands, about dreams and revelations. And those stories are the center of art and crafts and our relationship with other life forces, including animals. For instance, moose, caribou, eagle, the crow, raven, reindeer, and bear, and so many. These stories encapsulate the spiritual forces and ancestral relationships. They speak to the legal traditions that are not captured in the colonial framework. They talk about vegetations and agriculture, about insects and medicines. They talk about astrology and science. And I want us to look at the current global environmental crisis. And most scientists are looking to indigenous peoples, their relationship with iconic animals. And some of these relationships are embedded in stories, and they are very symbolic to understand and have an insight into how indigenous peoples have managed very tough environments in a very sustainable manner and culture. And we can begin to talk about some iconic symbolisms and animals that define this terrain in North America with indigenous peoples. And these are really a representation of how people have navigated with nature in harmony and respect that we have never witnessed. We have lost this, and this is a time to go back to the first principles. And I begin to show you all this just to demonstrate that within all of these are embedded stories with significant epistemic pathway about how to deal with nature. And this is in sharp contrast with the philosophy of subdue and conquer. And within these stories, we also see another worldview of art and creativity that define a people, that inspire a people through their relationship with animals and other life forces. And so the ABS Canada Research Project conducted a 4-year study captured in about 13 chapters in a monograph. And one of them that really speaks to the intersection of ICH and global environmental crisis is a study that made a link across ICH, indigenous languages, stories, oral literature, and legal traditions, and provided insights into the plural legal and philosophical pathways to access and benefit sharing as a critical policy strategy for biodiversity conservation. And as some of us may know, the ABS framework was set up by the Nagoya Protocol and is one of the tools to incentivize indigenous and local communities' ecological investment on sustainability. And through this study, we discovered that instead of looking at colonial legal traditions, for instance, intellectual property, about royalty sharing, and is still within the philosophy of subdue and conquer, to take Mother Nature as our own instrument to subdue and to use it without reference to tomorrow. We found that there are legal traditions in indigenous communities that have an alternative framework to approaching access and benefit sharing. And we found those in stories. A very leading Aboriginal law professor called Larry Shattrand was able to extract the principles from the Dene stories. The Denes are the indigenous peoples of Canada, mainly found in the Northwest Territories. And about 9 of their stories were explored in order to extract principles that are suitable for access and benefit sharing. And those principles are mind-boggling in a way because Aboriginal legal traditions are supposed to be the component legal tradition in Canadian jurisprudence. And that has been affirmed by the courts and is being implemented by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So the principle of equity, just like the keynote speaker was saying, the principle of reciprocity, of codependence, and egalitarianism, those are the principles that were deciphered through these stories, which are the real lived experience of Aboriginal peoples in the way they engage with nature. And so the stories are as diverse as there are linguistic diversity. They are diverse in themes, in substance, in subject, in audience, in imagery, and in purpose. So these stories are of indigenous peoples and their language. Collectively, they are indicative of environmental ethics of stewardship, accountability, and overall egalitarian worldview of humanity's relationship with other life forces. And this is in contrast and far removed from the dominant ideology of subdue and conquer that has driven the whole world and humanity into this current crisis. And so what do we take away from this? ICH is a very powerful tool for managing environmental crisis. And it is true that the ICH Convention made a lot of references that draw the connection between ICH and environmental stewardship, but they are really indirect and embedded. And there has never been a time better to begin to call that into action in terms of reifying the importance and the connection between intangible cultural heritage and environmental accountability. So efforts at reviving indigenous languages should aim at valorizing its epistemic value and its epistemic value added. Beyond fiction, accompanying stories are inherently insightful and potentially incredible resourceful tool to reimagine policies for combating nature deficit. So the point then is this: it is important that we safeguard indigenous languages and stories. But beyond safeguarding, how do we valorize them? How do we call them practically as a pathway to environmental ethics and accountability? This has to be part of the DNA of UNESCO and the ICH program. Thank you very much.